Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Living Authentically, Becoming Your True Self, the podcast where we explore what it really means to live, speak and lead from a place of truth and kindness. As ever, I'm your host, Sue Whitaker. I am a life transitions and identity coach, and I guide individuals through significant life changes, helping them to rediscover their true selves and embrace new beginnings with confidence and clarity. So today, in this episode, I actually want to talk about another important aspect of our identity, which is known as our narrative identity. So what do I mean by that? Well, it's the stories that you tell yourself that helps you to make sense of the world around you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this episode to go through a little bit more detail what a narrative identity is and how it has an impact on us both in the past, present and future, but also how it actually appears at different stages of our lives. So let's dive in. So narrative identity is the internalized and evolving story of the self that a person constructs. It has three key areas, which basically is reconstructed past, how you interpret previous experiences, perceived present, your current self-understanding of what's going on around you, and your imagined future, your goals and aspirations. Now, the life story itself presents a sense of unity, purpose and meaning, helping to explain who you are and how you became that person and where your life might actually be going. Now, to go into a little bit more detail, reconstructed past is very much focused on previous experiences. Now, the mind, obviously, as we know, is, I suppose, a very complex computer. But actually, what we remember and what is actually factually correct can be slightly different. So when we look at reconstructed past, it's not necessarily a mirror image of what we experienced, but more about what we remembered about that experience. So let me explain. So to give you an example of one of my reconstructed pasts, when I was younger, I didn't like water. I actually got very upset every time I was put in the bath, had my hair washed or went swimming. So one of the things that I actually remembered was no matter how long I actually had in the water, I always had a negative experience. That means that even today, when I start to think about being in water, I actually still remember or interpret that actually it's a dangerous place to be. I'm not necessarily a strong swimmer, and I always struggled with learning how to swim confidently. So I think that probably has something to do with it as well. The perceived present as such, so your current self-understanding, is very much about how you see yourself in the world around you. I mean, this could be anything from how you consider how well you're doing with things, whether you're actually feeling like you're on top of life as such, or whether you've actually got other areas of your life that you're struggling with. The perceived present is actually that. It's perceived. So again, when you sometimes look at things around you, maybe take a moment to notice what you actually perceive is the case and what it might actually factually be the case. So again, another example for you. So at the moment, when we actually see people walking past us on their daily routines, there's a good chance that we will actually have an idea in our head of what they're doing or where they might be going. And again, we will look for indications of what we believe is the truth. That could be how they're dressed, where they're walking to, whether they're walking quickly, whether they're walking slowly, whether they're on their own or with people. All of these little different pieces of information gives us an idea in our mind of what we think is happening. But actually, just because somebody is walking very quickly doesn't necessarily mean that they're urgent. It could just actually mean that they actually have a fast walking pace. Equally, if somebody is actually chatting and laughing and walking slowly with friends, it doesn't necessarily mean they're not stressed. It just means that they're at that point in time, they're actually enjoying the company around them. And again, the final one we talked about was imagine future. So this is all about your goals and aspirations. Now, personally, goals is a very masculine phrase. So I sometimes tend to look at things like your intentions and aspirations rather than goals. Everybody has normally an idea of what they think their future is going to be. Now, this could be very far into the future, so years, decades, even ahead, or it could actually just be next week, next month, next year. Regardless, there is an element of what we actually think is going to happen. So whether we're going to be in a different job, whether we're going to be in the same house with the same family, etc., etc. And sometimes when we imagine that that might actually change, then if we actually think that it will change to something that we're not comfortable with, that again will have an impact on how we tell ourselves the story of what will happen. So I guess an example could be something like, okay, I'm not going to be successful at that particular project, at which point you may actually tell yourself that every time you're going to get items for that project, that you're not going to find the one you want, or you're not going to be successful in obtaining all the right information or, I guess, constructs for that project. So you might feel that the project is doomed to fail before it's even got off the ground. Again, a lot of what the stories of what we tell ourselves are actually very indicative of to what we actually will be able to achieve. So the key features to some of this identity, there are 4 key features to it. One is that it's selective. Oddly enough, you don't actually include every event, only the ones that you feel defining. I don't know about you, but when I deep into the past, I actually know that there have been some areas of my life that I would actually feel have defined how I felt about things in the future. Now, that could be because it's been a significant impact on me, or it could just be a moment where something really memorable happened and I've never let it go. So I guess in order to give you another example, one of the things that I actually did when I was growing up was I always used to love animals. I actually had quite a lot of animals because I was an only child. So I did a little bit of the mummy, mummy, can I have? Or daddy, daddy, can I have? So I think at one point I ended up with goldfish, cats, rabbits, and birds. So anything that I could basically put at home, or anything that my parents could effectively get their hands on because they were cute. So one day, what I remembered was my bunny rabbit that actually lived outside was actually eaten by foxes. Now, obviously, I was a young child, so I wasn't really told that. What I was told was that my rabbit had run away. Obviously, I wasn't allowed to look in the hutch, and I was encouraged not to get any more rabbits. But what it meant was that the construction of when I think about that particular animal is that I actually have quite happy memories, because I think that I put in my head that she was actually just going to go somewhere and play with other bunnies that she liked, which was probably in some areas true. Whereas if I'd have actually seen what was left of her, or maybe the blood in the hutch that I was told about later when I was older, then it might have a different view. Another key feature of narrative identity is that it's structured like a story. So it has characters, it has settings, it has turning points, and it has themes. So much like when we actually watch a show, on TV or a film, there are people there with motivations, there are different settings, and sometimes it doesn't necessarily mean that it's accurate. Sometimes we blend stories or memories and put them actually into one key story. So another aspect, or another feature as such, is that it's dynamic. Your narrative identity changes how you reinterpret experiences and therefore anticipate the future. So a lot of the times, sometimes when you actually go back into your past, whether that be through therapy, through counselling, etc., if you actually realise that the story that you told yourself is actually a little bit different now that you're older, because you're looking at it with a different lens, or your understanding maybe a particular setting was different from what you originally thought, that can have a significant impact on how you think and feel about things, and also what your future will be. So again, I'll give you another example from my side, and I'm going to stick with the animal theme. So when I was younger, I really, really enjoyed horses. And if anybody's actually known me for any length of time, they'll know that I was actually horse mad when I was younger. I never, ever thought that I would actually be owning horses when I was older in my life. And one of the things that I really liked about horses was the fact that they could carry you. Now, let's move on from the fact that whoever domesticated horses, we actually tried to domesticate them by, as a good friend has told me, putting something sensitive in their mouth. That is one of the most sensitive areas, and also sitting on their backs, which is actually one of their weaker areas. But anyway, let's move on from that. So the key thing is about my experience with horses was that I always felt that they were almost fantasy, that they were out of my reach, and that I wouldn't necessarily get to interact with them on a regular basis, let alone actually call one of them my own. So when I was actually 40 years old, I actually ended up meeting with somebody who owned horses, and actually my dream as such came true. I actually ended up interacting with horses, getting to understand what they were like, and also I ended up owning, and I've owned horses ever since, which has literally been for me a dream come true. But one of the things that we did when we actually went to buy one of our first horses was we actually went and visited her in the stables. Now, my husband came with me at that time, and one of the things that he did was he said that he believed that horses were quite smelly. I actually disputed this because I very much knew from my experience that when they're in the field, yes, of course they smell because they're outdoors, but they don't necessarily smell of poo. Stables, however, because they've been using them, smell of poo. Clean stables don't, but obviously we have to clean them up. So again, his experience or his understanding of it was that the horse would actually smell. When we actually met with the horse and interacted with them, he actually suddenly realised that his opinion was that yes, the stable definitely smelled, but the horse didn't. So again, another example of how it can actually reinterpret your experience. And I'm pleased to say that it wasn't just for that reason, but my husband is truly a horse lover and loves both of the horses that we have today. So the final feature that I wanted to talk about was it draws on cultural scripts and personal meaning. So one of the things that we talk about as identity is obviously where we've come from, our culture. I haven't actually done a particular episode on this because I think it's very broad, but if you're actually very believing in a spiritual identity or a spiritual deity, then the key thing could be is that if you believe that you have broken a law of theirs or a rule or done something that they would disagree with, you might actually think that you may be expected to have something bad happen to you because of that. So that's just, again, a really simple example of how having cultural scripts or cultural identity, etc., put on us from a young age can actually have an impact on the here and now. So why does narrative identity matter? Well, interestingly enough, research shows that people who frame their life stories with growth, with redemption themes, tend to experience higher well-being and resilience. So conversely, narratives dominated by loss or contamination, i.e. where events turn bad, can correlate to poorer mental health. There are actually a few examples in this, and I just want to bring it a little bit more into real world by giving them to you. So again, Let's have a look at career changes. So someone might actually have a narrative that leaving their corporate job was a courageous step towards actually doing something that they really truly believed in and that mattered. And that in itself reinforces an image of resilience. Subsequently, someone might actually narrate themselves and say that leaving the corporate job is actually a failure of theirs because for whatever reason they've decided to give it up. And again, then there's a self-image of the fact that they're not good enough. Again, if we look at overcoming adversity, reframing challenges like health challenges, for example, as a turning point for personal growth can create a redemption sequence. However, if actually what you feel is the health challenge is as a consequence of you doing something wrong, then it will actually be quite the opposite. Life transitions coaching, which is one of the things that I love to get people involved in, is looking at things of tools like future self-visualization and story reframing. And that in itself can help clients actively reshape their narrative identity. And again, as I literally just said, if you can reframe and reshape that identity into something positive, it can have a really good impact on your well-being. So let's have a quick look at some of the areas in our lives of where the narrative identity starts. So it actually starts very much in our childhood, the foundations of storytelling as such. What happens in our childhood is that we actually start to have an emergence of an autobiographical memory. Autobiographical, shall I say? I'll say that one more time. And at around preschool age, children begin to form coherent memories of personal experiences. So that could actually be in line with the fact that we go to school. Although it's actually preschool age, people might ask us, what did you do today? How did you do it? And what events did you do? Where did you go with mum and dad? And then people actually have a habit of telling the stories. And that's where the child suddenly starts to learn that stories is something that they can use to tell about their personal experiences. One of the other things that they do as well is children actually get read to by their parents, or at least some do. And again, being told stories is normally related with a positive side. And the other part I would say is that although it sometimes the stories could be scary, the fact they have a positive association to it, again, makes children want to make sure that they tell stories. The other aspect of this is also about the role of caregivers. So again, conversations where parents ask about open-ended questions and include emotions on them help the children build richer, more organised stories about themselves. The other part of it is also about social interaction. Talking to attentive listeners fosters accurate and detailed narratives, laying the groundwork for identity construction. So it really does start at the very, very beginning of the childhood. One of the things I was going to say about my childhood was that I remember a story when I was actually in nursery. It was Peter and the Wolf. And for some reason, my only real memory of it was that the characters were conveyed by musical instruments. So birds, wind instruments, etc., etc. Now, I don't exactly even remember what the full story is. And I don't think I've actually looked it up. So I might do that. But anyway, one of the things that we talked about was the fact that it was done at nursery and it was a story that had a lot of serious meanings. The fact that it was the music meant that it actually hit me at a very, very personal level. Unfortunately, what it actually led to was it meant that I actually ended up having some night terrors as a child. And for some reason, it involved a wolf. Now, I'm not necessarily going to pull that apart completely. I mean, I do have some ideas of why it might have been a wolf. But for some reason, I associated it with that story, which meant that even now, in my 46th year, as soon as I actually start talking about Peter and the Wolf, I actually feel like I've got a little bit of a shudder down my spine. But anyway, the key thing I would say is that particular story clearly has actually led to me having very different views and feelings about it, and also about things involved, like musical instruments and the animals involved. So let's move on to adolescence. This is where we talk about building the life story. And the three things that we end up with at this point is identity actually takes more of the centre point. It becomes a central task. The identity formation is at the heart of adolescence. Teens start integrating past experiences with present self-concepts and imagined futures. So again, they will suddenly understand that they actually like something because of a past experience, or that they don't like something of a past experience. And they'll already have a conception of the fact that they might not like it. So if we look at something like food, it could well be that they don't like vegetables, that they'll only like this type of food, or they'll only like McDonald's or something like that. Oops, name drop. Anyway, the key thing is that the narrative complexity grows. So adolescents begin crafting stories that explain motivations. It explains choices, why they decided to do that, why they actually decided to change their mind or turning points. And often it's influenced by the cultural scripts and peer relationships. So again, I could go into a lot of detail here about how that depending on where you've come from and even in what location of the world will mean what things are more important to you than others. But I think we all get the point of that. The other aspect of it is that we actually start to explore risk and exploration at this stage. So the stories reflect experimentation with roles and values. So basically they start asking themselves who they are, where they're going, what they're going to do once they get there. And the whole idea behind this is so that they can actually go deeper into building that life story. Bearing in mind, when you're already adolescents, you've already had a whole wealth of experiences with people, with items, all throughout the world. So the chances is that your perception of what you've experienced is already going to be changing, because you're already going to look on those experiences with a slightly different lens. So the final bit here is when we move into adulthood. That's the refinement of the story, of the identity. So life story suddenly starts to become a personality core. In emerging adulthood, narratives become more coherent, more thematic, and they start to integrate moral, relational, and vocational domains. So this is all about right from wrong. It's all about wanting to understand who they are and actually what they want to do. So what they want their life story to be. I don't know about you, but when I actually think about life story, I think about I have no idea how I'm actually going to explain it without explaining everything that's already gone before me. But one of the key things that I talk about when I talk about my own story is I talk about how I felt my childhood went, what my adolescence was like, and obviously now what I've achieved in adulthood. The other part of this refinement is a focus on purpose and unity. Adults revise their stories to emphasize agency, continuity, and often they also consider about major transitions as well, such as career, family, grief, etc. Now, this is a real interesting one for me because, again, when I actually think about major transitions, what I actually focus on a lot in my life is that I had grief quite early on. And when I say grief early on, it wasn't unexpected grief, but I lost my first grandparent at age 11. And he was a grandparent I was very close to. So my memory of it is that I actually took it pretty badly. Now, I do remember that he wanted to be buried. And I also remember that I wanted to wear the dress that he bought me, which was more of a party dress rather than a funeral dress. But I still think they let me actually wear it. But again, when I talk about grief or when I think about grief, my mind goes back to how I was when I was 11 years old, that I was angry because he left, that I was sad that he left and that I couldn't see him again, but also that I was actually showing my own character by being a little bit forceful by saying I wanted to wear that dress. And then the other part of the adulthood refinement is the cultural and social influences. So life stories drawn are shared on cultural narratives, shaping how individuals interpret success, adversity, and legacy. Now, I can go on and on about societal expectations, but one of the things that we talk about a lot, or at least I talk about with people, is the fact that we are expected to have a career, get married, and have children. Now, I personally don't have children, and I would actually call myself a voluntary childless couple, or at least me and my husband. We've actively made the decision not to have children. And at the time when we got married, all that I could hear were people saying to me, when are you going to have kids? Or, how's married life? When are you going to get the little pitter-patter of tiny feet? I actually got quite annoyed by people when they were telling me these things. But the main thing that I would do is I would actually look at what it meant that I didn't have children. Some people actually were really unhappy with it. But I don't know whether they were unhappy because I was courageous enough to make that choice, or whether they were just felt sorry for me because I wouldn't have anybody in my older age to look after me. That goes into a completely other perception as well, that children are actually supposed to look after their parents when they're older. Now, I've got some very strong opinions about those, and I'm not necessarily going to go into it here, but feel free to talk to me if you want to understand more about it. I guess the key thing is for me is that narrative and what we tell ourselves and the story that we tell ourselves is actually quite important. It's not necessarily based purely on fact. It's based on how we remember our memories. Now, as I've grown older and collected more and more memories, I'll be honest, I think that some of the memories back in my youth have definitely been merged together. And again, I can only really remember the ones that actually feel defining. I don't necessarily think I can remember my last day at school, but I definitely remember the time when I was young and I fell in the playground and hurt my teeth. I remember that I actually ended up having such a sore mouth that I had to have soft food for what it felt like ages. I remember having chicken pox and scratching, and my mum telling me not to scratch even though I really, really wanted to. And there are other such stories like that I could keep going on about, but it's those sorts of memories, again, that I actually struggle to put on a specific detail of what I was wearing. All I remember was the people that were around me at the time and the support that I was getting. Now, some people might actually be able to remember the exact detail of it, and that's great if you can. It doesn't necessarily mean that your mental health is going to be better because you remember those details. The main part of a narrative identity is basically making sure that you look at it from a point of growth and well-being. So the key thing is that you need to make sure that the frame of your life story is actually more around the positive aspects or turning the negatives into positives. So again, I've spoken about this sort of thing before, especially with my childhood. I don't necessarily think that my childhood was particularly happy for multiple reasons. However, what I would say is that if I haven't had the experiences that I've had today, I wouldn't actually be where I am right now. And the reality of it is the life that I have now, I actually like. I really like it, in fact. And one of the reasons why I say that is because I took my own responsibility on my shoulders to make the life I wanted to. Classic example was about the horses and horse ownership. Never in my wildest dream did I think I would do that, but here I am. Not only do I own a horse, I own 2 horses. And I see them twice a week, and I love that. I have an idea of what my future's going to be, or at least what I would like it to be. Whether I can make it a reality, I guess, is going to depend on multiple things. But for the first time in quite a long time, I'm looking at the future with actually quite a bright light. And I'm really looking forward to getting there and all the things falling into place. Because whether it will happen exactly as I imagine it, or whether there'll be a broad element of it, it will, I'm confident, happy that it will go in that direction. So yeah, that's pretty much it for this week. So I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks very much for joining me as always. And again, if this episode has sparked something in you, I'd love to hear about it. You can connect with me on my social media platforms, and as always, they'll be in the episode description. So until next time, stay grounded, stay curious, and keep living authentically. Thanks, and bye for now.